Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to wait just a minute more to make sure everyone gets into the meeting. We always have, it always takes a little bit for everyone to filter through. And we'll get started in just a moment. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Nico Larco, and I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon. I'm also a professor here in architecture and urban design, and I'm thrilled today to be moderating this webinar on scooter parking. For those of you who don't know, Urbanism Next is based at the University of Oregon, and we look at the impacts of emerging technologies such as shared mobility, self-driving cars, and e-commerce on cities. And what we're really interested in is how those things impact land use, urban design, building design, transportation, real estate, and how that in turn affects equity, health, the environment, and the economy. We do a lot of research around the broad topic, but also a lot of research in individual pieces, of which this research that we're going to be presenting today is one of those pieces. So to frame a little bit of what we're going to be looking at today, as we often say in Urbanism Next, a lot of this technology that we're seeing out in the world is coming, it's developing, and the big question we ask is how is it that we can leverage this new technology to achieve community goals? How do we make sure that we are not victims of these technologies, but instead are really leveraging to get to places we'd like to be in our cities and in our communities? So if we're thinking about how we need to use this technology to get to equity and sustainability and climate goals, we need to rethink a little bit how we use public space for some of these things. And that is definitely the case with scooters. I'm sure many people have run into issues of where scooters are parked and the clutter that we see in a lot of cities about this. And so the question is, how do we do this in a way that feels responsible, that supports the travel that we'd like to have happen and that creates the built environment that we'd really like to have happen? So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. I'll also just say quickly that if you have questions throughout the webinar, please put them into the Q&A chat. So the people that we've got with us today is Anne Brown, who's professor at the University of Oregon in 3PM, and also the research director of Urbanism Next. We also have with us Greg Metlasky, who's a bicycle program specialist for the District Department of Transportation, where he's worked on a number of different things, including planning. He's responsible for planning bicycle and scooter parking in the capital, and as well as managing the installation of expansion of the district's portion of the capital bike share system, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Pedro Homem de Hovia, and he said that I could guess how to say his last name, so I'm hoping that was close, is a senior policy and project manager at Polis. I've been working with Pedro for years and realized that I've rarely ever said his last name. He coordinates working groups for Polis on governance and integration and road safety and transportation security. He's got a lot of experience in strategic planning, public participation, universal design, pedestrian accessibility, and safety. And so the way that we're going to do the webinar today, Anne's going to start with a report on, with a presentation on the work that they've done, research work they've done. And from that, we're going to switch over to comments by Greg and Pedro. And then from there, we're going to be able to have a question and answer session, which I'll kick off, and we'll be looking forward to getting your questions. So with that, I'll pass it over to Anne.
Great, thanks, Nico. I am delighted to be presenting this work today about shared scooter parking and really how much scooter parking do we need in cities. So this work was a collaboration between the University of Oregon, so myself and doctoral candidate Sian Meng, and then professor at Cornell, Nick Klein, and then two researchers at Lime, Calvin Thigpen and Brandon Haydu. So this is a collaborative effort. I'll happy to talk more about what that research partnership looked like, but I want to dive right now right into what we studied and what we found. So we're all here, as Nico mentioned, because there's a lot of concern around micromobility parking. People have a lot of feelings about micromobility parking in different cities. It's one of the most commented pieces that cities often hear about from the public. And cities also have a lot of parking solutions, right? So we have dedicated spaces. Sometimes there's parking incentives, monetary incentives, education via apps, etc. But one thing we don't really know is how parking corrals, so these dedicated parking spaces, which are one of the biggest interventions that cities can implement, how they really affect parking behaviors and how much parking is needed. So do you need 1 corral? Do you need 10 corrals? And then how does that vary by land use? So this is really the core at what we're trying to get at with this research. So how parking corral density and land use relate to 2 variables. So that's what I'm gonna cover today. The first is the share of scooters parked properly. So we're gonna call this parking compliance. The second piece is the demand for scooter parking. So the number of vehicles. So the way these 2 relate together is first we're asking this question of how many corrals you need, these groupings of parking spaces. And the second question is really answering this question of within a corral, how many spaces do you need? Do you need enough space for 2 scooters in this corral, 20 scooters? And how does that again look like over land use? So we answered this using city data provided by Lime from cities across the world, primarily from the US and Europe. And for this first question of scooters parking properly, we looked at cities that had mandatory parking zones. In other words, scooters are required to park in designated areas. For the second, we looked at the opposite. We looked at cities with either no or very small mandatory parking zones. And the idea here is we didn't want to artificially depress or affect the number of scooters we were seeing based on the mandatory parking zones. We wanted this to be a lot more of an organic sample and distribution of scooters. So again, these 2 pieces, I'll walk through a little bit more how we measured them before diving into the results. So we used trip data from March and April of 2023. So this is scooter vehicle data aggregated up to these months. The first to measure parking noncompliance, it would look like this. We broke all of our cities up into hexagons, these small hexagon areas throughout the study areas. And for parking noncompliance, we looked at each hexagon and we calculated what percentage of trip ends were within about 10 meters of a parking corral. So there's some GPS drift there. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but to our best of our knowledge within the designated parking area. So again, here's a graphical representation of that. You'll see 3 different trip ends. Those are those bold green dots, and then 2 different parking pins or corrals. So we'll use those interchangeably. So 2 of the 3 are within the parking corrals. 1 of the 3 is not, which means it's a 1 in 3 parking noncompliance rate, or 33%. So that's the first piece. That's how we calculate parking noncompliance. The second is parking demand, and this was the average number of vehicles in a given area over the study period. So again, imagine this is the same hexagon over time, 5 different time points. At 6 a.m. we have 3 vehicles, 7 a.m. 1, 8 a.m. 4, and so on. We add up all these vehicles, divide by the number of time periods, and we have the average number of vehicles present during the study period. Okay. When we looked at parking compliance and parking demand, we wanted to understand the broader context that these scooters were operating in. So we included variables including parking pin density, and then a whole host of built environment and population characteristics. So population density, intersection density, points of interest, and those might be things like, this is DC on the right, and this might be things like the National Mall, museums, schools, bigger points of interest. We also include distance to city center and then 9 different types of land use categories. We ran a series of descriptive analyses along with some regression and nonlinear modeling. I'm not going to present all the equations, but I will get to the results. So first, I'm going to overview the parking noncompliance rate. This is the overall results. Before I walk through individual ones, let me just give you a quick overview of how to interpret this graph, because all the results are kind of baked into this piece, and I'll break them down one by one. What this shows is, I want you to pay attention to this vertical line in the middle. Anything, this is essentially 0. Anything to the left suggests that that variable listed is associated with decreased misparking. Anything to the right is associated with increased misparking. And then there's a few colors here as well. So the greens mean it's statistically significant result. In other words, when we see decrease or increased rates of misparking, we can be confident it's not due to chance. There's something really happening here. If the dot is gray, that means anything we see could be due to chance. We can't rule that out, so you should essentially just ignore that. It's not different than 0. Okay, so pay attention to the green, and then the magnitude of those is really the how much it can sway those results. So I'm going to walk through these and tell you what matters and why. The number one piece is that parking pin density, how many parking corrals a city provides, is the most significant predictor for parking noncompliance rate. Put another way, when you try to predict how much parking noncompliance is in a city, parking density, the parking corral density, explains about 85% of that variation. So it's hugely important for explaining parking noncompliance. Probably pretty intuitive. When we mapped out all the different observations of parking noncompliance in these hexagons that we defined relative to parking corral density, we saw this pattern. Now, all these little dots are each individual observations. Now, you might start seeing a pattern here, but we wanted to see, okay, if we smooth all these individual observations out, what can we see? And so that's this graph here on the right. So parking noncompliance is on the y-axis, that vertical axis, parking corral density on the horizontal. And what you'll notice is there's this really, really steep drop-off in parking noncompliance at a certain point. After that, there's not a huge change in parking noncompliance when you start moving to higher densities of parking corrals. And so what we really wanted to know was, where is this inflection point? Where is this point at which you have this big return on investment, really big gains in improved parking compliance, and then after that, pretty marginal gains? We found that elbow point, that big inflection point, is around 20 to 30 pins or corrals per square kilometer. It's about 50 to 80 corrals per square mile. Put another way, it means that pins or corrals are spaced about every 200 meters. So that a person at any given time is no more than about 100 meters or 1 minute away from a parking corral. Now, I know that might seem daunting as a city imagining installing parking corrals every 200 meters. This is verified by quite a number of other studies looking at people's willingness to walk different distances. So we feel pretty confident in the results from these data. The next finding I want to highlight is that we found that parking coverage, in other words, how much the parking corrals are distributed across space and how evenly, really matters when parking density is low. So this graph here shows parking noncompliance on, again, the vertical axis. And you can see there's a really steady drop off as parking coverage increases. So again, that means how evenly parking is spread throughout an area. This is overall. When you look at really high density areas, that relationship largely breaks down. And that's because these are so closely tied. When you have high parking density, you're also going to have coverage largely. So that is not as clear of a linear relationship when you look overall. We also found, when we look at land use, we found a U-type relationship between land use intensity and parking noncompliance. So here's 4 different land uses: population density, distance to city center, intersection density, point of interest density, and all of these are showing higher rates of noncompliance at the very high densities and the lowest densities, with the most compliant parking at those middle densities. We also found that noncompliance is relatively high in residential and tourism areas relative to other types of land uses. So this is the parking noncompliance rate across the different study cities. And you can see, again, the trend of this over different land uses. The last piece I'll highlight is there's some city level effects here. This captures things that aren't captured up in terms of land use and densities, et cetera. It has to do with things like some cities have more clustering of parking or parking deserts. So maybe they have a lot of parking in one area and then none for a very large swath of space. But that specific layout of parking and other things that we're not able to measure in the other categories are captured in these city level effects. Okay, then this next study, moving on from now that we know how many corrals and how many areas we need to park, we're now going to look at how a parking demand. This is how many spaces for individual scooters should you be providing in corrals. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not going to be presenting findings about you need 3 spaces in residential areas and the end. It's going to vary by city. Okay, so everything I'm presenting is really relative to other land uses. And this is because cities have different size fleets. They have different, context they're working with. And so if you have a city that has a fleet of 500 scooters, they're likely going to have different numbers of parking spaces than a city with 5,000 vehicles. So this is all really presented in relative to different land uses. So again, let me orient you to these graphs I'll walk you through. It's a similar idea where there's this essentially 0 point, although in this case, the 0 point is actually 1. So anything over that 1 vertical line means that this factor is associated with more demand for parking, so needing more spaces. Anything to the left, anything under 1, there's less demand. Again, similar story with the colors. Anything that's in green means this is important. This is statistically significant. Anything in gray, basically ignore this. We can't tell if this is, we can't attribute this to anything but chance. Okay, so let me walk through this. Finding number 1, again, probably quite intuitive. Parking density and coverage are positively related to parking demand. So we see more demand for scooter parking where we see more parking density provided and more parking coverage. We also see largely point of interest density, intersection density related to the parking demand as well. And in general, they're linearly related. So when you have the more points of interest you have, the more parking demand there is, and so on. Parking demand is different in different land uses. And again, I'm not going to tell you that you need 3 spaces in residential land use and X number in other ones. But what I can tell you is that the need for parking is the lowest in residential land. And then this is all the relative demand, the demand relative to that residential use in other areas. So you can see that the demand is greatest in areas that have leisure destinations, that have mixed uses and tourism areas. And then higher than residential, but lower, so kind of middle level, in areas that have a lot of transit. And this is more things like transit stations, like big hubs, office land uses, and then commercial. So what does this all mean? What do we recommend? We recommend first providing sufficient parking corrals. This gets back to that first finding. So providing parking corrals about every 200 meters, meaning that people are able to reach a corral within about 1 minute walk. This is the way to meet demand and maximize compliance. The next is to ensure parking corral coverage is evenly distributed, particularly in low density environments. And what that means is really ensuring that the spaces are spread across space rather than clustered in a certain one. So it matters, in other words, how the 10 corrals you install are distributed. And finally, provide enough parking spaces within corrals to meet the parking demand across land uses. And with that, I'll thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Greg.
Hi, hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks for that presentation. Good morning, everybody. I am Greg Matleski, a bicycle program specialist with the District Department of Transportation here in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. So thanks for that presentation, Anne. The findings pretty much reflect what we see here in the District of Columbia. We definitely confirms what we've seen here since scooters and dockless bikes have come here past 7 years. So, it's pretty intuitive, provide parking, plentiful and convenient parking outside destinations. We find that here in the district that people really want to park properly, and they do so when they are provided with the bike racks, or corral at or near their destination. And so we find that people usually lock to improper stuff. We're talking about like trees, street signs, fences, whatever. Improper spots or free lock, basically locking in the middle of a sidewalk and causing clutter when racks are full or there's no parking provided. So everything from this study pretty much reflects what we're seeing here in DC. So I have a little presentation here about what we've seen in the district and how this looks to the study. Let me bring this up. Just make sure, are you all able to see my screen? All
Yes,
right, that's
you do.
good. And just a word of warning, I may be joined here in a moment by one of my cats who can't decide whether he is inside or outside the office. So apologies to see a cute little tabby cat hop up here. But yes, let's see, let's go into it here. So yeah, so here's a map of our what we call trip ends. So here's the District of Columbia. We have a little scale down here. So the more purple it is, obviously the higher parking demand. And so what we see here is that, you know, most of our parking demand is oriented downtown in these commercial areas. So lots of demand. You see in these little shades of purple. So this is we have, you know, our central business district down here. We have the National Mall, still a lot of tourism, a lot of tourist demand here. And then we have our high density neighborhoods up here to the north here. So that's where we see most of our parking demand. Whereas in the more suburban parts of the district, suburban in quotes, we see less demand. This is, you know, less population density, few or no retail destinations, no office space, nothing. So the demand there is obviously very low. So obviously, you know, you provide more parking where there's demand. And of course, you can see here these little corridors here. These are Connecticut Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue, and they are clustered mostly around like metro stations. We see here as well, these little shades of purple. So it's very important to provide parking at these destinations. Just a little background here on the District of Columbia. So we are 700,000 residents and among 69 square miles. Dockless bikes first arrived in the district back in September of 2017. The scooters arrived a few months after that in March of 2018. And it was a little chaotic at first when things launched. Bikes and scooters were kind of being left everywhere. And so in 2020 and 2021, the Council of the District of Columbia passed a law that, amongst other things, required that scooters be locked to things starting in October of 2021. And so that has sort of solved one problem and sort of created another. So people are parking a little better than what they were before. But now the parking demand has sort of outstripped our supply of bike racks. So as part of that law, we are also required to install 1,000 bike racks per year for 3 years. And so we are in the last year of that mandate. We've hit the 1,000-year mandate the previous 2 years. We're going to hit it again this year, but it's still not enough. But some info about dockless here. You know, we have 4 dockless operators. 18,000 dockless devices are permitted in the city. I think about 16,000 are actually deployed at any one time. We had about 6.7 million dockless trips in the past year in 2023. That does not include Capital Bike Share. That is our docked and hybrid bike share system. And there have been over 29 million dockless trips since 2019. That's when we get the most reliable data. Isn't this going? Excuse me. Yeah, so how we handle bike and scooter parking planning here in the district is a lot of it is mostly through user request. So we have a 311 system. People submit requests through that. We review it, work with the requester, and then add it to this nice little ugly map you see here in the middle of the screen. So this map shows basically where all the bike racks in the District of Columbia are located, or at least the ones that we know of. Green is you know, where racks are. Purple are where racks are planned to go. So those are requests. And these dots aren't just like one individual bike rack. You know, they can represent one bike rack. They can represent, you know, a bank of like 20 bike racks. So, but we also rely a lot on dockless data. So that map I showed before, this is the data that we get from the operators. You know, we can see it in real time. We have a platform that we use to monitor this stuff. And so that's a great way to see where these hotspots are. And add corrals and other scooter parking to address that. And then, of course, field observations. You know, when we're out and about and we see where supply or demand outstrips supply, we can just go in, add bike racks pretty easily. And then, of course, we get bike racks through zoning. You know, based on the land use. You know, residential, commercial, based on the size, how many dwelling units, so on and so forth. Their developments are required to provide bike parking. And so we get quite a lot of racks that method, about 350 to 400 per year, which is great. And so going into corrals here in the district, here's our corral map. showing the distribution of corrals throughout the district. You can see most of them are focused downtown here in our central business district, in our commercial areas. And we have a bunch here in Georgetown, another tourist and commercial destination. And so, yeah, they're pretty evenly scattered throughout the commercial districts, commercial areas of the district, not so much in the residential areas, which is something we're trying to address. We're going to go forth and add a bunch more corrals this year. But yeah, we have over 220 in the district. We share these locations with our operators, every month, every time we add new corrals. And so what they do, some of them, they actually include them in their apps for riders as preferred parking areas. And so we see a lot of compliance with that. But what's great about corrals is that they help daylight intersections, as we call it. So what that means is, the area between legal parking and the intersection. Oftentimes it has to be cleared for sight lines and safety purposes. Sometimes people park there illegally, park motor vehicles. And so having this physical space there actually prevents people from parking, daylights the intersection, makes it safer. And while also decluttering by getting scooters and stuff off the sidewalk. It's great. So just a few examples of some corrals here in the district. Here's one right by my house here in Brooklyn. This is Do Drop In, a really good bar adjacent to the Metropolitan Branch Trail, which goes on street right here. You can see it in the corner, left corner. This is an illegal parking space that we we're able to fit, let's see, 4, 8, 9 bike racks. So that's 18 parking spaces. That's great. This doesn't work. Excuse me. Here's another one. This is at 2nd and C Street Northeast. This is right outside the U.S. Capitol building. One of the challenges we face here in the district is that there's a lot of federal land. So the U.S. Capitol building owns a lot of land around the Capitol building, and they don't allow bikes and scooters, or dockless bikes and scooters, to end their trips there. So we have what's called perimeter abandonment. And so where people using these devices park them at the end of these zones. And so we need these big honking corrals to accommodate all this demand. So as you can see, the corral is really only the space right here, but the demand is so intense that it's actually spilled out into the parking lane right here. So we're actually in the works to expand this corral to accommodate this demand. Here's another one on the other side of the Capitol building, as you can see in the corner there. This is at New Jersey Avenue and D Street. Yeah, we have 8 racks here. We also have a corral on literally the other side of the street here. It is full every day with people going to and from the Capitol. So yeah, trying to meet the demand here. And so for folks that are looking to add bike and scooter parking to their jurisdiction, some tips. Can't recommend enough the tried and true inverted U bike rack that we have right here. It's a simple design. It's timeless. It's cheap. It's about like $120, $130 per unit. It's very versatile. Surface mount. It can go on rails. Really great. And what's awesome about using surface mount racks is that they can be installed in about 10 minutes versus in-ground racks, which take 24 hours. So it's really quick, easy to install. We put a lot of these in every year, over 1,000, as I mentioned before. For folks that sometimes people want to put branding on them and such, which is fine for the most part, but we recommend if you're going to do that, only do it at the ends of banks of racks, and make sure the design doesn't actually block people from parking at the rack. So here's some racks at a development here in the district where you can't really lock a bike to it. And don't get funky with it. Don't use some of these artistic bike racks that some vendors are selling because they often are not really good and don't really work. So here's an example in the district on the left. This is one of the only times I've ever seen a bike parked here. And as you see, it's only locked to the wheel, so not very safe, secure. On the right is a design that I saw in Indianapolis. Not very good. And of course, you have some more typical looking bike racks that look a little neater, but no, these are also bad. These racks only have 2 bolts in them, and so they can be used as a fulcrum and pulled out of the ground, as I will show in this video here. That they are very easy. This is just with one hand, you can rip these things out of the ground. So stick with what's known. The inverted U bike rack is great. Can't recommend it enough. Sorry. And then Yeah, one other tip, I guess, is when you're adding bike racks, I didn't want to put this in writing, but ask permission, or excuse me, ask forgiveness, not permission. Bike racks are usually very popular. You don't really need to waste your time going and asking every individual person for bike racks. Obviously there are exceptions. In the district we usually coordinate with schools, houses of worship, and of course if anything is going on private property. So we need permission for that, but for the most part, you can put these things in. No one's really going to mind, and the most reaction you're going to get is people are going to love it. So that's all I have for this presentation. I'll turn it over to Pedro. So let me stop sharing here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. Pedro, you're up.
Hi.
There we go.
Well, it's going to be difficult to talk this. Well, first of all, let me thank everybody for the invitation. So I work for Polis. Polis, for those who don't know it, is the leading European network of cities and regions advancing transport innovation. So specifically interested in innovations that can make urban mobility become more safe and equitable and sustainable. So we've been following let's call it the shared micromobility phenomenon for quite some time now. Many of our members have had the challenge of dealing with it and of being the early adopters or the first in line to deal with the practical and policy challenges all of this places. So regarding the report, I mean, let me tell Anne and all the team, I mean, really congratulations. I've read the report. It's a really, really good piece of work, I think. When you go for the policy recommendations, you kind of feel, duh. So what's new? But, if it's so duh, then why are so few cities really doing it the right way? So I think really that the best compliment that can be made to the report is really that it clearly shows the way to go. I think we'll be very happy to disseminate it and replicate it and get cities in Europe at least to replicate this approach as much as possible. It is clearly the way to go. Some very short comments about it. So, maybe 6 here. Number 1, it's, if you work in the field, you know that the easiest way, if you want people to do the right thing, make it easy for them to do the right thing. It's such a basic principle, and yet we constantly forget it. Making it easy means making it clear what's the right thing to do, and making it, requiring the lowest effort possible to do the right thing. We tend to, have a moral judgment. I think it's very human for us to have moral judgments about the behavior of people, about the behavior of companies. And the problem with these moral judgments, people, they're not civilized. They don't know how to park an e-scooter. The problem with these moral judgments is that they really cover the structural problems. If you have a recurrent wrong behavior, then there's an underlying structural factor. And that's what local authorities must deal with, is the underlying structural problems. And here, clearly, lack of proper parking is an issue. About clarity, what we recommend is to avoid at all efforts creating parking on sidewalks. So as much as possible, these corrals must be created through the conversion of existing spaces for car parking, because obviously that's the way of dealing with another problem as well. What do you do with public spaces with high demand and with no car parking to convert? I don't have an answer for that, maybe a case-by-case approach, but as a rule, we should avoid at all costs to create these spaces on sidewalks, because then, you miss the clarity. People don't, you tell people not to park on sidewalks, but then you create spaces there. So that's one point about the clarity. About the low effort, definitely, I think the study speaks much better than I would about the number, about the distribution, and I would also recommend the consistency in the design and signage of these corrals. We have some cities that have been trying and doing some interesting stuff on it. One of our members, for example, Budapest, they've designed, template spaces where they care about the signage, so that it's easily visible where you can park. Another point here is that, we must acknowledge once and for all that, the problem that we're dealing is the monopoly that cars have over public right of way, not only this for the circulation, but also for the parking. And we have to understand that, we can't avoid the tough choices. We can't expect e-scooter parking to, be solved by magic, or people to figure it out. We really have to take the tough choice of converting car parking spaces into spaces for bikes and e-scooters and what have you. And, not doing that is trying to bypass or avoid the tough choice, and it solves nothing. And at least now with this study, we have a clear direction in terms of what to look for in terms of distribution and density, and also, as Anne mentioned, capacity. From the cities that have been doing this kind of thing, we know that, well, there's obviously resistance, and it's not only public backlash. What we find is that the public is usually much more amenable to the creation of these hotspots than expected. And I think that's also because people are sick of the parking problems with floating e-scooters on the sidewalks. They want order, and that's okay. The complexity also comes from the fact that in many cities, at least here in Europe, they also have to. So Greg pointed out the issue of the federal government owning the land around the capital. For us, it's also an issue because many sub-municipal governments, so districts, boroughs, what have you, so below the city level, they own the land there, the public right of way. They are in charge, at least if they don't own it, they are the ones in charge of managing traffic and parking there, and often they are also the ones receiving the revenues from the parking there. So I think that I'm also a full supporter, as Greg said, of using the spaces where you don't want people to park, so to increase the visibility of crosswalks, which means intersections by rule, to create these corrals. So it has road safety advantages. It has consistency advantages. You always know where you're going to find these parkings. And then finally, for words for the industry, I think that while having floating assets was very exciting and the most interesting use of the available technology at the time, I think 5 years in at least, I think it's time to acknowledge that having floating shared micromobility just is not so exciting. It has created a problem also for the industry, and the corrals seem to us like a great practical solution that makes the best use of the available technology, but also prevents its downsides. And also, certainly in urban area, in consolidated and denser areas, but also where the cities, want shared micromobility to grow and flourish. And that is lower density areas where we want shared micromobility to feed the mass transit corridors, the public transport system. And so thinking about the placement of these corrals in lower density areas together in tandem with public transport, bus stops, subway stations, multimodal mobility hubs, that's also one of the ways we're evolving here in Europe. That's it.
Great. Thank you, all three. This is fantastic. And you see from the questions and the comments, there's a lot of interest in this. So I'm going to be moderating this. I'm going to recommend, again, for people to add their questions to the Q&A button. I'm going to try to get through some of those. But as a moderator, I get to ask the first couple ones. So one of the questions I have is, really interesting, and you talked about some of the different factors that end up just deciding if there's going to be more or less parking use and parking number. And when you went to use, you talked about residential, just plain residential. But then when Greg presented his maps, you could see that there's a lot of parking use that's happening in dense residential areas. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference in density of development and how much that's impacting the parking use and
Sure.
demand.
So yeah, definitely there's a lot of variation in land uses, right? In dense residential versus single family, more sprawling neighborhoods. Our analysis controlled for density separately. And so density itself was this really important, population density was its own variable. And so that was definitely predictive of parking demand and how many spaces you would need. And so that's kind of separate from the residential, if you would say, I would say that's already captured by that factor. So absolutely dense residential areas need more parking spaces than say really low density residential areas.
So I wonder if you had separated out, instead of saying the proportion to residential, if you separated out low density and higher density residential, if the higher density residential might start looking like some of these other ones that we're asking for more demand.
That's possible. We categorize these hexagons largely based on the dominant land use in them. They're not that large of hexagons, but some of those might have also then switched into this mixed category. If you have that much, the highest density residential is often in with the more mixed uses in general. So it's possible. I mean, I haven't looked at every hexagon we had in our mix, but just knowing general city typologies, that's my guess.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. So I think everyone on the webinar probably is very familiar with the problem of clutter and how much that kind of is a barrier in a lot of cities, has created a barrier to more deployment or popular sentiment about these things. And thinking about the recommendation you had, Anne, which was one kind of parking corral every 100 meters. And I wanted to ask both Pedro and Greg, one parking corral every 100 meters, does that seem terrifying? Does that seem feasible and doable, the right thing? And then if you can talk a little bit more about what's your experience in getting the political and public support to provide this type of parking at that ratio, or even less than that?
So yeah, I'm happy to take that. Yeah, so I would say it depends on the density of stuff. So so I think downtown, in the downtown central business district, I think we hit or exceed that corral density, and even then it's still, I would say it's not enough. So I guess it really depends on the amount of devices that are permitted. But we're looking to add more corrals to these areas this summer, or this spring and summer, to try and get a handle on this. But yeah, I'd say it's definitely
and the political temperature on doing these things. Are people typically happy to have them there? Are you having trouble? What kind of conversations do you have to help make that happen?
So they are, for the most part, very supportive. People are very supportive of this sort of stuff because, it does have these safety benefits and does declutter from the sidewalk. So people do see a benefit when they do come in. So some people are a little skeptical at first when we do these, usually in residential neighborhoods. But over time, they see the impact and see that, okay, people are no longer walking to my fence. They're walking to this thing now in the street. And so what really helps in the district, again, we have these clear zones that are not legal parking. So we really don't have to ask anybody permission to use these spots. If we want to repurpose a parking space, we have to do what's called a notice of intent here in the district, and that opens up a 30-day comment period. And so we do that in certain instances where we can't use the clear zone, but for the most part, we just use these areas where you can't park anyway. And so it's a nice way to declutter the sidewalk, provide parking for both personal and shared bikes and scooters, and make it safer by daylighting and everything. So we get a lot of support for this sort of stuff, and so we hardly ever run into controversy or opposition.
That's great to hear, and also interesting that you really try to steer clear of taking away parking spaces, which goes a little bit to Bedro's comments of this might actually be able to be a win-win to take away parking spaces while you add the scooter parking, but obviously that does have like political weight, political challenges to it. Pedro, is there anything you want to add? About
I mean, about the 200-meter spacing. I mean, I think it's, I mean, as you know, European cities are much different from most American cities, and one of the biggest differences is the shape and the proportions of the street grid. And actually, you know, this kind of distance fits well with the distance between many intersections. As I said, I think intersections would be the best targets for us to create these corrals, and that's where many cities are creating them. And regarding how do you approach and communicate, you know, I worked for 21 years at the local level, and I did have to create some things. Well, not these types of corrals, but you know, sometimes take away parking spaces, and you know, create other sorts of measures. And I don't know what kind of tricks Greg uses. My favorite trick was saying, you know, I got to do this. It's beyond me. It's the law makes me do it. It's because of safety. It's because of the, you know, disability discrimination. The fact is, I mean, if you look at it, a city that doesn't, I mean, for example, in the U.S., a city that doesn't create, that doesn't have a proper policy to ensure enough well-distributed parking spaces for the parking of shared micromobility services that it authorizes. I mean, I would argue that's clearly clear liability in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the point is also in many countries, because there's a anti-disability discrimination European directive as well. And I mean, it's obviously arguable that if you don't find a solution, it's not only because people may be hurt, it's also because your organization may be liable. Civil and criminal responsibility, also you as a professional. So saying, you know, I have to do it, sorry, but I really have to do it. I mean, for me, really worked well all the time. Here's a trick. It's not being recorded, right?
Yeah, no, not at all. Yes, we are being recorded. Perfect, thank you. So going to some of the questions that people are asking, Josh Kaczynski asked, do you think the things you're finding here with scooters might work for other micromobility, dockless bike share, for instance? Do you think that the things we're learning here are probably going to be applicable to those other modes as well? And that's a question, I think, for Anne first.
It could probably be for all of us, but thanks, Josh, for the question. Yeah, research finds typically similar willingness to walk. I posted a link to a site about scooters, but I can post one about bike share in a bit. So it seems like bike share users and scooters have a similar willingness to, distance they're willing to walk, or amount of time they're willing to walk to their final destination. So I'd say the results might not be identical, but probably not dissimilar. And then to your second question about lower parking demand in residential zones, I mean, our research certainly showed that across different land uses, et cetera, you're seeing the highest rates of noncompliance in the very, very dense areas, probably where there's just more vehicles than there is parking capacity, and then the lowest density areas, which is probably where we're not seeing enough capacity or enough parking spaces and corrals. So people's willingness to walk doesn't change with the density of the place they're in. They're still going to only want to walk 1 minute. So that can be tricky in these lower density areas, certainly. The other comment, I want to just piggyback on the last piece about clutter and public perception. So I posted again in the chat a few links to previous studies, and I know Pedro did as well. When we've looked at cities across the US, at least, we've actually found pretty low rates of parking non-compliance, at least in commercial areas where you're providing wide sidewalks. And so I think there's an important piece here to think about what kind of, are we setting micromobility up for success? And part of that is this piece of, are we providing enough space, either on the sidewalk, in the street right away, for people to be able to compliantly park? Like if I look at the street I live on, according to the City of Eugene code, there is nowhere I'm able to legally park that scooter. And so what am I, as a rider, what am I supposed to do? The other thing we found in previous research is that cars actually mispark at higher rates in the commercial areas we've observed. And so there's this interesting kind of status quo bias about what people see and don't see. And so I think if it's absolutely reasonable and good for cities to want to ensure a clear right-of-way that's accessible by all users, but I think cars should certainly be brought under that umbrella. And then in terms of public perceptions over time, I'm wrapping up another study about scooter perceptions over time. And we find that overall, people are really concerned about scooters before they arrive. And then largely all of the negative fears they have don't fully come out to bear. And so support rises over time when there's a well thought out program in place. And that goes for like users and non-users. Even non-users say, like, oh, actually, this wasn't as bad as I was expecting, which seems positive. And then I think Brian had a question in part about in the chat about signage, et cetera. That's the next piece is like, does any kind of interventions change at the ground level? Can you do something that changes people's perceptions on a block-to-block basis and how they think parking is going? So that's next steps. That was a lot in one little answer.
That's great, Anne. The high density answers here. Let me ask. I'm going to combine some of the questions that we got in the chat and the Q&A. Mobility hubs. So we actually did a series of webinars on mobility hubs for cities that had actually done the hubs, and a complete surprise to me, but across the board, everyone who's actually done them said one of the biggest challenges with the parking areas was charging and figuring out how you make electrification work for these things. And so I'm wondering if any of you can talk a little bit about that as something to consider, any best practices, rules of thumb. Maybe we'll start with Pedro. I see your hand just went up.
Yeah, let me just complete something, or maybe add something to what Anne said about your previous question. I think first of all, we're not talking about an e-scooter issue. We're talking about a parking issue, and I think that it's time to make sure that the colleagues that are running the parking, in whatever city that is, that they are brought to bear on this. It's not like, us like little sparrows trying to nitpick here and there on the parking. No, it's getting because this is a parking issue. Now, we have a growing diversity and quantity of shared and non-shared micromobility vehicles. We have a growing quantity, of deliveries that are done sometimes by van because of the growth of e-commerce, then by vans, but also by cargo bikes, by this and that. And I mean, our parking policies and our parking infrastructure in many places is completely outdated. So this is a parking issue, and they should be brought to bear. It's not for the nice people who care about e-scooters. No, it's for the parking people, who can be nice, by the way, nothing against them. But they should be the ones, first of all, dealing with this. I mean, regarding the charging and the mobility hubs, we have to understand that electric motors, electric engines, they're lighter, they're cheaper, they're smaller, they're easier to install, cheaper to install. So they're going to go on all sorts of stuff. Number one, not all those sorts of stuff are going to be shared, but I would say that it's a sure bet that we'll see other types of things being shared in the years to come. And even if they're not shared, here comes another question, is these things have batteries. Batteries can catch on fire. So there's a growing number of public transport authorities. And I think that inevitably you will see a growing number of office building companies forbidding entry of these batteries into buildings and into subways and into buses. We're seeing this already. I think it'll just grow with time. So while it's important to standardize and to certify the batteries and to make sure, we're not using crazy stuff all around, the point is we will most probably need places to keep these vehicles, or at least their batteries, in the open space. And I mean, does that count as parking? Is a different issue? I mean, it's innovation. Innovation always goes beyond a category. So maybe sometime for now, we'll be talking about how to park the batteries, not necessarily the rest of the vehicle. So these things have to be versatile. Whatever corrals or whatever we create or hubs, they must be versatile. And yeah, so for e-scooters, for bikes, for whatever comes next.
Great, great, and I appreciate the framing of it's parking. We have to deal with it as parking, like not just micromobility. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, on the electrification aspect, I would say one of the biggest challenges with e-bike or e-scooter charging at scale is that pretty much every battery and bike scooter manufacturer uses their own proprietary charging system or charging plug. And so that makes it very difficult to, like, you know, for a municipality to, you know, provide a public charging station, you know, that's otherwise not just like, you know, an outlet in a wall. So, you know, it's something akin to like how cell phones back in like the late 90s, each company had their own sort of thing. And then I think it took EU regulations to be like, all right, you have to, you know, to cut down on waste and all this stuff, you need one universal charger. And so I think that's something that will need to happen first in the United States and I guess the world as a whole, before you can really see e-bike or e-scooter charging infrastructure at scale. One of the other challenges I would think is just like the security of providing e-bike charging, you know, it takes a while to charge an e-bike. You know, it takes several hours. You know, bringing your own charger everywhere. You know, you're liable for theft, vandalism, so on and so forth. So it's something that I've seen other companies have developed solutions. You know, like little lock boxes for your own sort of charger and stuff. But again, I really think you need this standardization of the e-bike and e-scooter charging plugs too, before you really see this stuff deploy at scale. But as far in the district, you know, for large developments, we do require that bike rooms have outlets for e-bike charging. But, you know, I think what we see mostly is people, you can remove the battery from your bike. So people mostly just charge at their office or in their home.
Great. I think we've got time for one quick last question. I'm going to choose the one from Amelia Brook. Good to see you here. If the enforcement, how do you think about enforcement of all this? Is this a problem of we're just not providing enough, or is there also a role of enforcement for this? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, let me just, if I can say this, you know, who's going to enforce? I mean, when we regulate, we have to create the conditions for people to follow the regulations, and of course, we have to enforce it. And the problem is, if the conditions for people to properly follow regulations aren't there, those who are in charge of enforcement will never provide proper enforcement because they're humans too. They understand, they're not idiots. And so this creates a vicious circle. And so, yeah, so again, back to the report, creating proper distribution. I would bet, I don't have the data, I don't know if Anne could see that, but I would bet that you get more compliance, not only because the places are available and well distributed, but also because those in charge of enforcing feel more confident in doing so. That's for a survey or something else.
Future studies, future studies. All right, I'm conscious of time. This has been a fantastic presentation discussion. Thank you so much to Anne, Greg, and Pedro. I want to remind people, if you're interested in these topics, I'm putting in the chat right now, we're having the Urbanism Next conference, which we do every year. This coming year, it's in Amsterdam. We've been doing it in the US for the last couple of years, but it's going to be in Amsterdam, October 9th to 11th. We hope to see you there. Registration is going to start in May. Program should be coming out in May as well. We'd love to see you there. Once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you to Anne, Greg, and Pedro for the presentations discussion, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Urbanism Next webinar. Thanks all.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Goodbye.